Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Louis Nelson. I am a professor of architectural history and the Vice Provost for Academic Outreach here at the University of Virginia. And it is my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cameron Monroe, who's delivering a Henry Lecture in Historic Preservation for this year. Professor Monroe is a professor of archaeology at the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He earned his BA from Berkeley and his MA and PhD from UCLA. He's a postdoctoral fellow in departments of African and African American Studies, Anthropology, and History at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Monroe's research broadly examines political, economic, and cultural transformation in West Africa and the diaspora in the era of the slave trade. And he has participated in archaeological field research in Armenia, Belize, Benin, Haiti, Israel, Sudan, and the United States. I had the great pleasure of inviting Professor Monroe to my graduate seminar just a few hours ago, my graduate seminar on the Greater Caribbean. We had a fantastic conversation, and so I'm very much looking forward to our time today. And it's also my great pleasure to just let everyone know that he is a college friend of our new dean, Dean Milot Hudson. And so we know that Professor Monroe is on his very best today because he actually has a college buddy in the audience. We're so delighted, Cameron, to have you with us. We're looking forward to this presentation. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today. And we all look forward to learning so much more about Revolutionary Era Haiti.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Sneha. Thank you, Jamie, for facilitating my visit today. As you mentioned, I've got a lot of fond associations with the University of Virginia, and I, of course, regret that I can't be there in person. But hopefully, one of these days, the world will return to some semblance of normal, and we'll be able to start visiting again. One of my first experiences in archaeology was actually working with Jim Dietz at Flower 200, just down the road from you all. And of course, you mentioned my long friendship with your new dean. Stephanie says hi, Malo. And since then, I've maintained a lot of close working professional relationships and friendships with people at the University of Virginia. So it's really my honor to be here to talk about my work in Haiti today. So while I introduce what I'm going to talk about today, I just thought I'd put a pretty picture up for you to sort of look at and think about. The lecture I want to give today is going to introduce some of the work that I've been doing in collaboration with Haitian authorities and the local community of Milot at Sans Souci in Haiti. Sans Souci was the royal palace of King Henry Christophe, the first and last king of the short-lived Kingdom of Hayti, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Before I talk about this work, I thought it would be helpful to admit that I'm a bit of an interloper, speaking to a group of architects. I'm neither an architect nor even really a Caribbeanist, although sometimes I play one in archaeological circles. I'm a trained historical archaeologist and an Africanist by training. As Louis mentioned, my long-term research is focused on looking at how architectural spaces and landscapes and the material culture we find on archaeological sites around the Atlantic world can shed new light on the different kinds of political regimes that emerged across the Atlantic world in relation to the rise and ultimately the rejection of the transatlantic slave trade. My previous work in Benin, West Africa, focused on the relationship between urban landscapes, memory, political power, and the Kingdom of Dahomey, which was, as many of you know, a principal supplier of enslaved people to the New World plantation societies. In 2010, my Dahomey project was beginning to come to a close. I was ramping that down to start writing it up and publishing it. And I began looking for another comparable context to explore similar issues on the other side of the Atlantic. Of course, that was the year that the devastating earthquake struck Port-au-Prince, which was then followed by a call by the then director of the Institut Sauvegardé du Patrimoine National in Haiti for assistance with the necessary development-related work, specifically related to heritage sites that would happen in the wake of that earthquake. Now, I was familiar with the Kingdom of Hayti and the site of Sans Souci specifically, largely through the work of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, Silencing the Past. Many of you, all of you probably have read that, and realized immediately its potential for exploring an archaeology of sovereignty in the Black Atlantic world. And I was interested in a number of very specific things about the site. First, obviously, I was interested in the way Trouillot linked the construction and naming of the site with the killing of Sans Souci, an architectonic attempt to silence the memory of a political rival. Second, I was also fascinated with the use of neoclassical formalism at this site. Right? None of my fieldwork in West Africa was associated with neoclassical architecture, but my experience in the New World had taught me how important it was, how important the neoclassical architectural style was in the emergence of colonial Atlantic world societies, and particularly its association with an ideology of rational, the Enlightenment rational philosophy, the spread of merchant capitalism, claims of cultural modernity, as well as in the New World, the entrenchment of race-based inequality. And I was curious to understand what it was doing in a context that was forged in direct opposition to slavery and the slave trade. Third, just as Vince Brown has recently argued that the rebellions of enslaved individuals in the New World could be read as an extension of wars for sovereignty in West Africa, the Africanist in me wondered if Christophe's political project might be interpreted in the same light, as an extension of the project of state formation that took root in the era of the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa. So there was something quite profound here to think about in terms of architecture, material culture, memory, power, and the fight for Haitian sovereignty in the wake of the revolution. Now, 2010 was obviously a devastating year for Haiti. I've already mentioned that. The earthquake centered in the south leveled Port-au-Prince, Legoan, and Jacmel. That earthquake was followed by international calls for assistance on heritage projects. And in conversation with Haitian authorities, between 2011 and 2015, we went back and forth quite a bit about what might be done. And we developed a plan for archaeological research at Sans Souci, which continued from 2015 until 2019, when the current political crisis engulfing Haiti, as well as the global pandemic, rendered our work untenable for the time being. So that long introduction is to say that the project that I'm going to, and the results that I'm going to talk about today, evolved in a relatively complicated context and really represent the first steps towards much broader archaeological and heritage management goals. So I want to do three things today. First, briefly, I just want to introduce some of the historical background to Sans Souci and the Kingdom of Hayti to give you some context on when and where we are in the world. I then want to introduce some of the previous heritage initiatives at Sans Souci by Haitian authorities in the Parc National Historique. And then I'll go over the methods, goals, and results of the Milot Archaeological project, outlining some of the discoveries of the 2015 and 2019 field seasons, touching on this topic that's in my title, the relationship between architecture and material culture in the constitution of Haitian sovereignty in the wake of the revolution. So let's talk a bit about the Kingdom of Hayti. The Kingdom of Hayti was a political project forged in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. In 1804, on the heels of independence from France, Jean-Jacques Dessalines founded the Empire of Haiti, declaring himself emperor for life. General Henry Christophe was installed as governor of the North and was stationed probably at the Milot plantation near the site of Sans Souci. In 1806, Dessalines was assassinated. The country split into northern and southern factions. In 1807, Henri Christophe was elected president of the state of Haiti, which was centered in the north by default. And then in 1811, he declared himself king of the Kingdom of Hayti. The Kingdom of Hayti was styled as a hereditary monarchy with a peerage system, which included dukes, counts, etc. He divided the kingdom into 6 administrative districts and 56 arrondissements. He instituted royal dictates that enforced a cadre of police, often referred to as the royal Dahomeys, who may have in fact come from Dahomey itself. And he established the Code Henri, which enforced what's remembered as a severe labor regime which brought rural production back to the levels witnessed in the colonial era. In 1820, Christophe suffered a stroke and purportedly committed suicide, at which point the Southern armies reintegrated the two halves of the region into the Republic of Haiti. This experiment in sovereignty was intimately connected to material statements of power and authority, drawing from pan-Atlantic symbols of political order and stability. Henri Christophe was an avid builder, earning him the popular nickname, Le Roi Batisseur, the Builder King. He constructed 15 fortresses, including the Citadel La Ferrière, which is one of the most famous sites in Haiti and the Caribbean as a whole, as well as 9 royal palaces across his territory. He reclaimed numerous pre-revolution plantations as rural seats of power, and these served as administrative and defensive sites to effectively integrate his territory. So he used the built environment and the landscape to integrate his political projects centrally. One plantation, Habitation Milot, became his primary residence and center of authority, and the site of his monumental construction, Sans Souci. Sans Souci was the principal royal palace complex, and it covered something on the order of 13 hectares. And its construction history is relatively complex. Most historical accounts indicate that the building was constructed sometime between 1811 and 1813 during Christophe's reign as king. However, numerous historical sources suggest the story is a little bit more complicated than that. Christophe was stationed at Milot as early as 1803 and probably actually occupied the main house at Habitation Milot. Norbert Faure, who was an eyewitness to the revolution and its aftermath, indicates that Christophe had already built a quote-unquote superb home for himself at Habitation Milot by 1804. The Haitian Gazette Officielle reports that 2 years into his presidency in 1809, he was already residing at his new palace at Sans Souci. And so those dates, 1811 and 1813, must relate to the main palace that one sees if you visit the site today, and that you can see in this image here from Karl Ritter, a German who visited the site in the 19th century. Earlier phases of palace building on the site undoubtedly took place. Sans Souci is known again for its neoclassical style, including its neoclassical facade, Baroque staircase, and orderly classic 18th and 19th century gardens. Galvin Bailey describes Sans Souci as an example of restrained Baroque classicism of the Regency and Louis XV reigns. And of course, this style has associations with the rise and expansion of Enlightenment rational philosophy in the Atlantic world, the spread of merchant capitalism, and again, in colonial contexts, the entrenchment of race-based inequality. And so the adoption of this architectural style is quite interesting for this particular king. On the one hand, it represents Christophe's adoption of the architectural language of liberty and modernity, declaring Haiti's equality on the global stage. On the other hand, this is an architecture of power, one that materialized social order and status distinction within this emerging state. Together, I think this is akin to what Doris Garraway has described as an emerging paradox between a discourse of political freedom and a practice of authoritarianism, in which Haitian rulers served simultaneously as liberators and subjugators of the rural peasantry. The historical and visual record also tell us quite a bit about the importance of different kinds of objects in promulgating this ideology of freedom and authoritarianism. And we see similar patterns in the material record in terms of the use of exotic and foreign material culture in establishing Christophe's royal authority. Indeed, sources at the time emphasize his emphasis on opulence, a desire for European taste, neoclassical design elements. Indeed, visiting the palace 8 days after Christophe's death, the German Karl Ritter describes the scattered vestiges of its material assemblage. And I won't read this here, but you can read along as I continue to speak. The emphasis, again, is on sort of the adoption of luxurious goods in a European style. Imported objects were particularly valued by Christophe at Sans Souci. On the top right, we have a portrait of the royal family, of the king, excuse me, commissioned by British artists in Regency style dress. On the bottom left, you see a British spode plate emblazoned with the royal sigil, the phoenix rising from the ashes of Saint-Domingue. Gilt ice buckets, coinage, right? All of this speaks to sort of transatlantic styles of material culture at the time. Interestingly, newspapers back in England and elsewhere also describe large purchases which speak to the scale of wealth and the desire for this material culture within the kingdom. So these objects provide a variety of opportunities for Christophe and his court to express the power and opulence of the royal family. However, they did more than that. Gregory Perrault and Tabitha McIntosh have argued that these public declarations of and advertisements for what was purchased, when, where, and how much was actually part of an elaborate and quite sophisticated public relations campaign to declare again that Haiti was here, Haiti had arrived, and it was an equal in the community of nations at the time. So collectively, buildings and objects were used to send messages of power and authority, both at the local level, but simultaneously worked to curry international recognition for this new sovereign state. With this background in mind, the site becomes ripe for archaeological perspectives on the origins of these material strategies and how they may have evolved over time, from Christophe's first being stationed at the site during the Revolution to the point at which he built this magnificent royal palace. So next, I want to describe some of the heritage work that has been done at Sans Souci by Haitian authorities. And then I'll talk about the archaeological work that I've done there myself. Sans Souci, of course, has been the target of concerted work by heritage specialists in Haiti for decades. It's located in the Parc National Historique du Nord. The park covers 25 square kilometers, give or take, surrounds the Bonnet à l'Évêque and the town of Milot. Milot is located right here. It encircles two additional Christophe-era sites, the Citadelle La Ferrière and Ramieres, two large fortresses on the top of the mountain. And the park was created by presidential decree in 1978 and then inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. It's a massive 13-hectare site with numerous structures. In discussions of Sans Souci, people tend to only talk about the main building here. But again, massive complex with a queen's palace, a garden, a barracks, and stables, and just structures all over the place. In the late 70s and the early 80s, in preparation for its entry on the World Heritage List, ISPAN and UNESCO architects conducted an intensive architectural survey of the site to document and manage these remains. They mapped all the major zones of the site, and using historical references and ethnohistoric accounts from the early 20th century, they were able to identify the possible functions of different complexes across the royal complex as a whole. ISPAN also initiated a number of archaeological excavations in the early 80s, largely to confirm and understand architectural relationships, to get a sense of foundations, to explore methods of resuscitating and repairing structures. They targeted the area of the royal gardens, and here you see excavations in the garden around a central fountain. They targeted the central Cour Caimitier, and that's the area that I'm pointing at right now with my cursor. You see plans of those excavations up on top. And they excavated down in an area called the Palais des Ministres, a small line of cellular rooms down below the Cour Caimitier and adjacent to the main royal palace itself. Very little of that work was published. My understanding is that much of the records were lost during the earthquake, but there is a campaign right now to document and digitize all the material that was collected during those excavations, and I can't wait to see that work come to fruition. One of the big discoveries by Ispan's excavations was the presence of buildings underneath the royal phase of construction at Sans Souci. And on the bottom, you see a plan view of the Palais des Ministres. These little square rooms, again, is what I showed you a moment ago. Digging down beneath those, they identified walls. And here I'm pointing at them with my cursor right now. I hope you can see that. A series of walls that are off angle and again constructed before that later monumental complex was built on top. And so that confirmed suspicions that there were earlier phases of construction and occupation on the site and begged out for future research. After the 2010 earthquake, the Parc National Historique was elevated as a major priority for national development campaigns. And this is how I got involved in discussing plans and ideas for an archaeological project here. One of my concerns in initially approaching and discussing my ideas for what one could do at this site was that plans for development seemed to be focused largely on tourism rather than preservation at the time, which could be potentially problematic for an already sensitive archaeological site. I was also struck that Ispan's narrative about the site was heavily architectural and expressed an extreme view that I thought on the unity and integrity of the site plan as a whole. It was presented as sort of one complex that was built and planned at the same time. I wanted to contribute an archaeological perspective to this project, which could add an appreciation of the nature of the historical growth and development of the site, as well as material patterns that spoke to hidden transcripts of everyday life for the people who lived at Sans Souci. I also was hoping, and still am, to use this site as a stepping stone to move out into the broader community of Milot and indeed across the landscape of the Plaine du Nord to understand the long-term landscape histories of these regions before and after the revolution. So I first visited Port-au-Prince in 2011 and started a conversation which resulted in 4 years of interesting and fruitful discussions and many visits to Milot to meet and communicate my ideas with the local community. And in 2015, in collaboration with Haitian authorities, we launched a project with very specific and targeted goals. The archaeological goals were to get a better understanding of the architectural history of the site and the building chronology specifically. We also hoped to reveal those patterns in everyday life that could tell us something about everyday material aspects of life behind the royal palace walls beyond what we get from the historical record, right? The spode plates and the gilt buckets, ice buckets. We wanted to know what kinds of foods people were eating, what kinds of goods they were making locally, what kinds of exchange relationships the kingdom was involved in. And that relates to the third point here, that we were interested in understanding how these material strategies of trade, production, and exchange tied into broader questions about the relationship between Haiti and the community of nations in the early 19th century. In addition to those academic archaeological goals, we also had very specific site stewardship goals. We wanted to produce documents and data that could help assess the site for both management and preservation purposes. We wanted to produce cultural and historical narratives for public consumption, both for tourists and for the local community. And we wanted to generate archaeological collections that might be useful in a potential visitors center that has been bandied about a bit, either in Milot or in Cap-Haïtien. Throughout the planning process, we made a number of key commitments, both to government officials as well as to the local community. We committed to redoing a non-invasive survey to remap the site with an archaeological eye. We committed early on to limiting our excavations to those that had been initiated by Ispan prior, so we could fully document and then report on those excavations. And then with permission, new excavations would be initiated elsewhere on the site at a very small and limited scale. We also committed to engaging in community engagement with the local community, as well as student training of Haitian undergraduates and graduate students from the Université d'État Haïti. We also committed to using a number of methodologies which would allow us for full digital data recovery, as well as data sharing. And we're working with a number of collaborators to make that happen. We've collaborated with numerous partners, agencies, and other collaborators throughout the history of this project. I normally put this slide at the end, but I always feel a little bit rushed. So why not acknowledge people right in the middle? We have numerous Haitian partners, both at the government level, but also at the local level, the Mairie de Milot, the Université de Haiti, and others. We've collaborated with a number of specialists, such as the Center for Advanced Spatial Technologies. Gillian Galley at the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery is helping us out with artifact analysis. We're collecting data virtually on tablets with a system called Cutaway. And we brought in Dr. Alexandra Jones from Archaeology and the Community to help us plan and think through a public community archaeology program, which brings kids on site and into our labs to teach about archaeology. And of course, we've been relatively well funded by numerous agencies in the US, and we appreciate all of that support. So one of the first things we decided to do was to go out and assess and redocument the topography and the architectural remains at the site. And we adopted a methodology using 3D scanning or terrestrial LiDAR at Sans Souci. Now, why would we scan the site? Eastbound had already produced an extensive plan of the site in the 1980s. So what's the point of bringing down a team to do this kind of work? Well, the plans were made of a relatively large scale. They were not completely comprehensive, and they included only a handful of profiles and sections, at least what I could get my hands on. 3D scanning documents a building as it is, right? You have a representation of a structure as it exists today. And then you can use that as a baseline to produce all sorts of other products, CAD maps and other sorts of profiles and sections. And so I brought down a team from the Center for Advanced Spatial Technologies. This is Katie Simon, who was literally the brains and the brawn of this whole survey campaign. She's incredibly daring, standing on high walls with a big piece of equipment. And we shot lasers at the whole site. This resulted in a data set that includes 14 billion data points, spaced at an average of 5 millimeters. So we've got near full coverage scanning of the whole site. This is an aerial view of the scan, so you get a sense of just how much was done. And then I have a rough video. We're still in the process of refining this and preparing this for public publication and dissemination, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the work that we were able to do. I'll just pause for a moment while you watch it. Ultimately, the plan is to produce a photorealistic scan that could be dropped into game engines, that could be used in any number of formats, both as a research tool as well as a heritage management tool. One of our goals is also to go back in 5 more years and redo this scan, and then compare compare the models and see whether walls have moved, if there's been any subsidence, and that would be an incredibly useful thing to manage and protect this sensitive archaeological site. Whoops, trying to move on to the next one. So with a scan like that, you can also produce all sorts of more traditional elevations and sections. And here you just get 2 slices of the site that we've produced with this technology. A top plan of the site, just using the raw scan data, right? Looking at that from the above, you get a pretty good sense of the site. And again, this is scanned to 5 millimeters. So we can really use it for a lot of archaeological purposes as well as heritage management purposes. And we were also able to convert it into a more traditional CAD map, which has become a base map that Eastbound and others can use in managing and caring for the site. So that was goal 1, to go out and document the site in as high resolution as we could. Goal 2, right, the creation of an archive of archaeological materials that could begin to say something new and interesting about life at Sans Souci, was facilitated first by re-excavating areas that Ispan had dug back in the 1980s, and then starting new excavations up in here. So we started in the Palais des Ministres. Archaeologists like boring names for where we excavate, so we called that Area A. And then we moved on to the Palais de therein, which we boringly described as Area B. Here's a view from across the site of Area A. Here are excavations in Area A1 in particular. And I just want to highlight something here. Here again, you have these cells, these small rooms stretched along this one area below the Cour Caimitier, this large courtyard up here. And then in front of those rooms, you have a walkway, okay, extending along and giving access to each of those rooms. These piles are the spoil heaps of Ispan's excavation, so those wouldn't have been there historically. I'm going to very briefly describe some of the stratigraphy in these units, one of the units, which is sort of, we can use to generalize across this area, to give you a sense of how interesting and complex the building history of the site is. We're looking into room 2 right now, and this is what it looked like after we cleaned it off, right? Much of this had been excavated out by Ispan, but they left most of the material between the walls, thankfully. So we had good stratigraphy after we removed all the sort of intrusive material that had been deposited over the years. What you're looking at right here, these little small tiles, those bits of tile are actually the original floor of this later structure, this royal period structure. It's right at the level of the tops of these walls. So we dug down through that, we fully mapped, documented, dug down through that, and encountered multiple layers of construction fill, including a giant blob of mortar that the builders on this site must have just dumped into this room as they packed it full of debris in preparation to build this royal face structure on top of it. So they're completely covering this earlier complex with building debris and construction debris of various kinds. Using picks, we blew through that material, and we came down on very dark soil filled with material culture and organic remains that an archaeologist would call a midden. It's a pile of trash. We initially thought that this midden material might have been deposited inside these walls. And so we thought, oh, that's really interesting. Maybe we have people are throwing their trash inside of one of these structures. However, after we dug down through that material, we realized it actually goes under these walls. So in terms of archaeological stratigraphy, this midden material is early. This building is built on top of it. And then that third royal phase is built on top of that. Okay, so we've got multiple phases of occupation at this particular site. And so we saw the same things in room 1, 2, and 3. In 2018, we extended our excavation south of those walls of that early phase structure and identified what? A long walkway, a retaining wall lined with a small brick wall and packed with sort of mortar surfacing material. This is a cutaway 3D model. We use photogrammetry to document all of our excavations. And you get a sense of the nature of this early structure underneath that later Palais des Ministres. Again, small cellular structures, 1, 2, and 3, small doorways here, and then a long walkway. It seems to mirror what was built later. So there's a continuity in the plan and the intent of this site. The same kind of building is being built on top of this structure. I just want to highlight again too, all these built rooms, these structures were knocked down around to the floor level. So you can imagine Christophe, his architects and engineers coming and knocking these walls down to exactly the right height, building those larger walls on top of it, filling it all in with construction debris, and then building their nice tile floors. So very interesting from an archaeological perspective. This presents a whole new host of questions about the history of this site. The material culture we found in that trash midden was exceptionally helpful for dating the site. It was rich in a whole variety of different kinds of material culture that was imported from Europe, all of which has very specific production dates associated with it. And when we were pulling this archaeological material up, we're finding tons of French fayances, lots of lead glazed earthenwares. And so we were thinking we're probably somewhere in the 18th century. This is a colonial period midden that later structure was built on top of. And maybe that later structure was even colonial. Well, at a talk I gave at Philadelphia at the UPenn years ago, Gillian Galley pointed out, nope, you've got some feather-edged pearlware that doesn't show up until post-1805. This is found way at the bottom of our excavation units, the bottom of those middens. And what it tells us is that that midden had to have been deposited after the revolution. It's post-1805. So in terms of the chronology of our excavations, we've got a midden that dates after the revolution. We've got a royal palace that was probably built in 1811. And then we've got this other structure in between. And the running hypothesis that we're working in is that earlier phase building was probably a version of the complex built by Christophe when he became president in 1807. So 3 distinct phases of occupation at this archaeological site. In 2018 and 2019, we expanded our excavations into Area A2, and we targeted an area where Eastman had identified a platform and a staircase in their excavations in the 80s. We cleared these areas off, fully excavated down next to them. There's an image of the staircase. Again, this is contemporary to that other earlier structure. It represents part of that second phase of building activity at Sans Souci. And here again is a cutaway 3D model to give you a sense of what this looks like. So you have a staircase leading up to this mortar-lined platform with then another complex built on top of it. What I find striking about this is just as in Area A1, where those earlier phase buildings seem to be an inspiration to later phase constructions, we have the same thing going on in here, and on this side of our excavations. If you look at the back side, the southern side of the palace itself, you have a staircase leading up to a mortar-lined platform right outside the back door of the royal palace. And if you look at the angles of intersection between the so-called Palais des Ministres of the royal phase and the royal phase palace, they make a similar angle to that stairway in the earlier complex that's been found below. So to me, what's going on here is you have a building complex, potentially one constructed by Henry Christophe as president, that's being expanded, but the overall design of the building plan is not changing very much. It's being expanded rapidly and exponentially into the royal area. A couple more points before I wrap things up. In 2019, we went back and excavated within that platform, dug down through all the construction fill. This is really thankless work. We dug down about 3 meters with all of these walls over our heads and identified a really astounding set of features. Underneath this is the main wall that you were looking at before. Underneath that series of walls, we found a series of much better dressed stone walls with a completely different color mortar, suggesting it was a much earlier phase of architecture, a much earlier phase of building going on here. It's very hard to get a good photo of what this looks like and how it relates to the later phases of architecture. So I'm going to show you a wireframe of the model that we did. And that wall that you were just looking at continues under and into the next unit and serves as a back wall for that staircase. Now, given that the architecture of this structure, the matrix of that wall is so different than everything that went before it, the running hypothesis that I'm working with is that this wall itself is a colonial period retaining wall for that entire area. And then it was reused to build a staircase in this later platform under Christophe's presidency, which was then covered over again when he became king. So we have, very interesting and complex set of architectural relationships at this site. I won't go into too much detail about our excavations in Area B. These were new excavations that we launched in 2017 and 2018, where although the building is very different, we found a very similar pattern. There had been some suggestion in the historical literature that this might be the original royal palace. There's references to Henry Christophe building a palace site on the area of the Palais de la Reine. So we thought, well, maybe that's what's going on here. And then the later palace was an extension. We excavated a number of units right in the middle of that. And what you're looking at here is the remains of a tile floor. And these are piers for an arcade, an arched walkway. All of this was tiled over. So that would have been open air arched walkway that extended all the way across this area. And then there was another sort of walkway out in front. We dug down through that material and found again another wall, a wall that was all off axis by about 2 degrees, suggesting an earlier structure was here as well, but on the general same plan and orientation. And then that was sitting on top of just heaps of construction fill, material culture, much of which had things like marble tiles, building material, which might have been the knocked down remains of a colonial era structure. All of that was knocked down, dumped, mixed with other kinds of fill, and used to flatten this landscape for this later construction activities. So all of this is to say that in a decade of construction, right, Christophe managed to refashion the landscape at Sans Souci at least 3 times. We have hints of a colonial period occupation. We have a post-revolutionary Midden, which was probably produced when Christophe and his cohort was occupying the site as governor of the North. And then we have a construction of a new complex while Christophe was president, and then the construction of the massive final landscape by Christophe as king. And the important thing I want to highlight here was 2 things I want to highlight. The first is this strong degree of architectural continuity, right? Possibly reusing colonial remains, building onto and expanding earlier buildings, and growing and expanding the site, but not changing its constituent parts as much as we might expect. Lastly, just a couple slides on material culture. I promised I would show you some artifacts. So here's just a couple I'll throw in there to sort of flesh out some of the stuff I was talking about, material culture in the palace life in life of Christophe and his court. We find tons of material culture in those middens, like lots of ceramics, bits of iron, glass bottle vessels, tobacco pipes. And the sources of these items represent a lot of the kinds of material culture that was just flowing around the Atlantic world in this period, right? 30% of the ceramics we get from these contexts are lead glazed earthenwares, French faïences. Some of these I think were probably reclaimed from Habitation Milot. Like I think when Christophe lived here, he probably collected that stuff from the existing French plantation. We also find small numbers of refined English wares like pearlwares and creamwares, and then lots of wheel-thrown utilitarian wares, these coarse wares, which the folks at Dax have told me are largely English. They look like English utilitarian wares that were circulating around the Atlantic world at the time. And so this is interesting because it speaks to Christophe's engagement on the global scale in terms of trade and exchange quite early. He's trying to get access to these imported goods, and he's successful, probably through Caribbean brokers, not necessarily directly through trading relationships with metropolitan states back in Europe. The biggest and most interesting thing from my perspective, however, is that 34% of all the pottery we find could be described as Afro-Caribbean wares, and that's what you're looking at here. Sooty, medium-sized cook pots in a style that's very similar to Afro-Caribbean pottery across the region into the modern period. The faunal record represents a wide array of domestic fauna, fish, shellfish, other sorts of critters. Here you have crab claws. And all this material was sort of chopped down in pot size to be cooked in those cooking vessels that I described just a moment ago. And so I find this incredibly interesting, and this is one of the new directions the project hopes to take, is that despite on the surface, we see this large-scale adoption or preference for European tastes and styles of material culture in those public-facing architectural and material records, What we see in these domestic contexts is traditional potting, cooking traditions, which represent clear evidence for Afro-Caribbean inspired cultural practices at the site in the years after the revolution. So, the historical and archaeological evidence I've described today presents some new insights into the role of architecture and material culture in the practice of political sovereignty in the Kingdom of Haiti. Public architecture embraced an Enlightenment ideology of universal liberty, and this is visible in the incorporation of neoclassical facades and architectural elements, the symbolic currency of the day for expressing cultural modernity in the Atlantic world. However, the eventual massive scale of the site sent clear messages of royal power and status distinction to an audience of Haitian citizens across the kingdom. That new, interesting archaeological evidence we have for the reworking of earlier site plans and to make them bigger and bigger statements of power. This speaks, I think, very, very clearly to Christophe's agenda to scream both to the world, we are here, we are engaged, and also to send messages of control, order, and discipline to the rural populace. It's also very interesting that in all of our archaeological surveys around Milot, we've never found habitation Milot. Whereas in many other places, you can see those old colonial sites present on the landscape. Habitation Milot does not exist. It's been erased from the material landscape of contemporary Milot. And I think that's because it's underneath this palace. So he covers over and reuses that colonial landscape, essentially erasing it from the viewshed of visitors and residents alike. He's silencing the colonial past here, right? He's erasing it from the viewshed of the general populace. Material luxuries similarly expressed European tastes and asserted claims to power, authority, and equality on the international stage, as well as royal supremacy at the local level. And yet, in those early Middens, those early post-revolutionary Middens, we see the continuation of an alternative cultural transcript written against the grain of broader Enlightenment era cultural practices, likely produced by women behind palace walls. We see traditional stews and meals produced in Afro-Caribbean cooking vessels, served on French and English serving vessels. We see this represents essentially the emergence of a Haitian Creole set of cultural practices and the highest echelons of power unfolding in private quotidian spaces. So importantly, our work reveals that these practices can be traced all the way back to the intervening years between the end of the revolution and the transition to monarchy in Christophe's Haiti. We have not yet touched or identified the period of Christophe's presidency. We have no material dating to that period at this point. And we're hoping to flesh out those periods in future seasons of research when we can come back to Haiti to continue our project. Well, I thank you for your attention. And I also have millions of people to thank, both in Haiti and around the world. But instead of going one by one, I'll just show you these pretty photos of folks on the site enjoying our work and having fun. And I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.